In high school, I used to nanny for this pretty well-off couple in the Bay Area. I really enjoyed working for their family, and I was sad when they said they were moving to Seattle. Before leaving, and basically during my time working for them, they had recommended me to some of their friends who also had kids. I'd done a few one-off jobs, and they were fine, but nothing quite like the Connors. About a month after their move, a woman reached out to me, inquiring about a more full-time position. A recommendation from Mrs. Connor, the woman said. Instantly, I could tell the woman seemed overwhelmed, and unlike most of the people I worked for, she was a single mother. Despite all this, she agreed to pay me double what the Connors paid. Part of that was because she had 2 kids, but for the extra, I told her it wasn't necessary. Still, she insisted. And we agreed to doing 3 weeks as a trial run, and if all was well, we'd sign me on full-time for the year. If everything could have stayed how it was the first 2 weeks, I might have accidentally gotten myself into a year of hell. Luckily, whatever was in that house decided to rear its ugly head early on, in the 3rd week. First, I'll back up and say that though this woman wasn't very cool, her house was so cool. She clearly was an exec at some tech company in the area or something. She never actually told me, but everything was automatic. She had a robot for just about everything except for taking care of the kids themselves. Basically, she made nannying a luxury. No cooking, no cleaning. I didn't even have to draw the kids' baths since, there's an app for that. The kids, 2 girls, ages 5 and 7, both very well-mannered and well-behaved. They too made nannying a bit of a luxury, but just when you think you struck gold, that's when you realize it's just a big turd. The girls sometimes had trouble when it came to going to bed. Normal kid stuff, and usually settled by a book or 2 and then lights out. Though the house was large, with several bedrooms, the girls shared a room for sleeping, each with their own twin bed on either side of the room. The older girl, Tilly, she'd slept in her own room at some point. It sat down the hall, still perfectly made up with its own bed. Why didn't she sleep in there anymore? Well, it was never explained to me officially, but from Tilly's perspective, it's because that room gave her terrible nightmares. So, early into the 3rd week, I put the girls to bed and I'm downstairs just watching some TV, as I usually do. Except unlike any other time, this time I heard running around upstairs. I didn't have the whole logistics of the house figured out, but I could swear the sound wasn't coming from the girls' room. Instead, further down the hallway. Maybe one or both of them were playing in the other room, Tilly's old room. I got up to check, but it was clear the noises had stopped once I started up the stairs, and then slowly started again down the hallway, towards the girls' real room. I was sure that I was about to catch them in the hallway, frozen, caught red-handed. As I approached the top of the stairs, though, there were footsteps, sure, but there were no feet to accompany them. The hallway was eerily empty, and the footsteps cut off almost instantaneously. I open the girls' door, and they're both still sleeping. I walk over to each of them to be sure that that's the case, but it's obvious they're sleeping for real. I even did the candy test where I said out loud that I had candy for the first one who could tell me what 1 + 1 was. It was a little trick of mine, and I hadn't tried it on these kids before. Still, nothing. So, that was weird, kind of spooky, and I really didn't have a great feeling upstairs after that. But it gets stranger. As I said, these kids were well behaved. They didn't talk back, they were caring towards each other. I never felt off leaving them to play with each other in the room or anything like that. One night, God, why is it always at night? Anyway, the girls were in bed, and as I was leaving their room and closing their door, I heard the sound of another door closing. Instantly, I looked towards the vacant child's room, and I swear, I see something dark, black as a shadow itself, but solid, peeking from the door frame before quickly disappearing. Logistically, not possible, considering that door just closed, and then there's the obvious problem of someone being in there at all. I lean back without taking my hand off the girl's doorknob and confirm no shadow, and indeed the door to that room is now shut. I creeped my way back into the girls' room. They weren't asleep yet, and I told them that I was kind of sleepy, and I think we should all watch a movie and pile on the couch. It worked for them, and so I quickly ushered them downstairs. I remember I put on 101 Dalmatians because it's a comfort movie of mine, and lucky for me, the girls liked my choice. I didn't fall asleep so easily that night, but I did eventually. We all did. I wasn't sure how to explain why we were all sleeping on the couch, so I told their mom that we wanted to watch a movie and the upstairs was scary. Yeah, I sort of threw the kids under the bus like they were the ones afraid, but it was definitely me. I just felt so silly by the time she got home. Had I been overreacting? I think not. The very next night, I heard something a little bit after putting the girls to bed. This time it was coming from the girls' room. Just the lightest of footsteps. No crying or screaming or anything to warrant the level of alertness that I was feeling in that moment. Without so much as a second thought, I found myself practically running up the stairs. I couldn't understand why I was so scared, where this urgency was coming from. Next thing I know, I'm opening the girls' door, only they're not sleeping peacefully as they usually are. I see Tilly straddling her sister. And not only that, she's got her pillow over her sister's face. Tilly is smothering her with the pillow. My knee-jerk reaction is to run over and pull Tilly off, and I do so relatively easily. And to my relief, Ella is alive and well. She's in shock, but she's awake and breathing. I look over at Tilly, who I gently toss to the floor next to me, and she looks like she's seen a ghost, like she'd just woken up or something. She doesn't appear to understand that she's just tried to smother her sister. The rest of the night was such a mess in my head. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared of scaring the kids, but I was also afraid. I had to call Mom. She didn't answer. I put the girls back to bed, but I sat in their room, trying Mom over and over. I watched those girls like a hawk for the next 3 hours until Mom finally arrived. I was only 18 at the time, but oh man, I was furious at this adult woman for ignoring my calls. I told her I wanted to tell her in detail about my night before I left, and so I did. She didn't even seem fazed. Halfway through telling the story, I was crying because I don't know why. Because I saw her kid almost kill her other kid. Such a little reaction from her. It was so eerie. I didn't like it. That interaction alone kind of sealed the deal for me. I was no longer willing to nanny for this woman, and I told her quite frankly that she should consider therapy for Tilly, or getting a priest in that place because something wasn't right in her home. To make things even weirder, I found out months later that Mrs. Connor had never recommended me to this woman. She had no idea who she was. In 8th grade, I used to babysit for my next-door neighbor sometimes after school. We lived in an apartment complex, and they were literally the door next to mine. We shared a wall and everything. The occupants were a single mother and her 6 or 7-year-old son, Adam, who only stayed with his mom every other week or weekend. Usually, I would pop over after school just as Mom was about to leave for work, and Adam would get dropped off by the bus. I'd spend about 4 hours watching him, or on Fridays I'd watch him for several hours, and sometimes fall asleep over there. As a 13-year-old, I wasn't incredibly observant of family dynamics, but I did notice that after doing this routine for most of my 8th grade year, I started seeing a man going in and out of the apartment. Originally, I thought maybe this was Adam's dad, but I was curious why I'd never seen him before. The next time I babysat, I learned that the man was Mom's boyfriend. I asked Adam if he liked the man, and he said, "Sure, he's nice." And he was right. The man was nice. And it was thanks to Mom's new boyfriend that my babysitting schedule dwindled a bit, and more mom time was made available. I thought that this was great for everyone. I would see them less and less, but every time I did, they looked really happy, especially Adam. Towards the end of the year, my schedule for babysitting became mainly Fridays. For a while, everything seemed really normal by the standards of a 13-year-old, until it wasn't. Remember how I said that we shared a wall? Well, this meant that we could hear everything above talking voices, and we could hear a lot of yelling. It was always during the times that Adam wasn't home, which I thought was a good thing and therefore didn't pay much attention to it. My parents are sort of mind-your-own-business sort of people, but on the same hand, my dad is very much someone who wouldn't tolerate hearing someone else in trouble. I'd often walk into the dining room or living room and see my dad sitting at the kitchen table, almost like he was trying to decipher what was going on, ready to act in an instant. Part of me didn't understand the big deal, but I didn't realize my parents were sort of shielding me from hearing most of it. Soon after all the fighting started, but before the end of the year, my parents told me they didn't want me babysitting for Allison anymore. I was pretty upset because, though I didn't see much of Allison herself, I really liked spending Friday nights with Adam. He was sort of like a little brother, and I always wanted a younger sibling. My parents offered minimal explanation, but I started to put together that it had to do with Adam's family, not Adam or me. Several weeks went by where I wasn't watching Adam. In fact, I hardly saw him, and I started to ask my parents why that was. However, they just told me that he must have been spending time with his dad. Then we stopped seeing the guy, the boyfriend, suddenly. No one asked what happened with the guy, but the apartment was quieter, and Adam was back to being there every other week. On a Friday, it was almost summer, Allison had asked my parents if I could watch Adam after school that day, just for a couple of hours. She was working her last shift, and her and Adam would be moving back to Spokane within the week. It was basically my last chance to see Adam, and with the dude out of the picture, my parents agreed. Why not one last hurrah? I was so excited I could hardly wait for school to get out that day, and I almost made it. It was the last 30 minutes of the last period of the day, and just as I was looking at the clock, a voice came over the intercom. The voice was naming a handful of students, requesting they report to the office immediately. There were strict instructions not to leave campus if our name had been called. I had no idea what was going on. Nothing like this had ever happened before, especially so close to the end of the day. I found myself walking towards the office with a group of people I soon recognized. They weren't all of my friends, but instead they were all my neighbors. Every kid whose name had been called was someone who lived in my apartment complex, and none of us had any idea what was going on. We all sat around a large table in the principal's office, a place I'd rarely seen the inside of. Even though I was sure I wasn't in trouble, I had a really bad feeling. I felt overly nervous, and I'd learned later I was experiencing anxiety, and what I'd have even later on, anxiety attacks. However, soon enough our vice principal was in the office with us and told us that there had been an incident at our apartment complex this afternoon. The details at this point were incredibly limited, but the gist of it was that the school was working with the police to determine when it was safe to release us. I should mention my school sat right next to my apartment complex, so we were a group of kids who usually walked to and from school. Slowly, over the next hour, kids' parents were picking them up, and others were given the okay to walk home. Soon it was just myself and my downstairs neighbors, Martin and his little brother Christian, who were left behind. My parents usually didn't come home until about an hour after I was done with school, so I was used to walking home and being alone, or going straight to Allison and Adam's, same with Martin and his brother, as we'd usually walk home together. But for some reason, today, the school wouldn't release us until our parents could pick us up. We still had no idea what was going on. It would stay that way for a while, until finally my dad came to pick me up. But we didn't go straight home. Instead, my dad took me to Starbucks and ordered me a Frappuccino. He never did this. I knew something was up. We parked, and he explained to me that our floor was currently a crime scene, that our family was okay, but that our apartment was currently off limits to the police. He reiterated that our family was okay, but that Allison's family, Adam's family, they weren't okay. He said we were going to go to the beach for a while, wait for my mom to get off of work, and he's going to explain it to me. On the way, he told me the whole truth. A truth that would be repeated on the news for weeks and weeks before news cycles found something else tragic to report on. Allison had been murdered, and her ex-boyfriend was the murderer. A murderer who had also killed himself. It wasn't just a murder that happened behind closed doors, though. The man had attacked Allison while she was in the shower. It's still unclear how he got into the apartment, but rumor was that the apartment's front office may have made the mistake of giving him a spare key. Allison had managed to escape her apartment at one point, proceeded to run around the parking lot screaming for help. Allison was being chased. Apparently, it was also the front office that noticed the horrifying event taking place in the parking lot. A knife-wielding man chasing a naked woman through a parking lot. He eventually captured her and managed to get back upstairs and into her apartment. They were only inside for a few moments before several gunshots were heard. Thank God Adam wasn't home. His school bus hadn't dropped him off today, and I have to assume he was going through something similar at his school, or maybe his dad would have picked him up by now. Either way, I'd never get to see Adam again. Everything grew very dark very quickly. One of those gunshots went through the wall of our dining room, essentially piercing the wall exactly where my dad had spent so many evenings sitting, listening. The whole house had trouble sleeping, and sometimes I'd find my dad sitting at the table, staring off, or even one time I'd seen him crying out there. Within less than 2 weeks, we were packing up our belongings and moving on. We'd originally signed a lease for another year just a couple of months prior, but my dad made it clear that we couldn't stay there anymore. I always assumed it was because of the whole bullet hole murder situation, and I guess in some ways it was. But the real thing, the thing my dad wouldn't tell me at first but did tell my mom, was that we couldn't stay there any longer because he couldn't stop hearing their voices. He couldn't stop hearing them arguing, even though they were dead. Call it shock, call it grief. I don't know what you'd call it, but I know that my dad isn't one to make a fuss or make things up. Sometimes I really wonder if he could hear that stuff, and maybe that's why he was crying. All I know is life got a lot lighter once we moved out of that place, so my dad was on to something. I still live in that same town, and this is still one of the most visceral murders to ever take place in the area, even 20 plus years later. Every time I drive by, I find myself looking up at the apartment and wondering, has anyone else experienced anything strange since living there?